Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. Claire Cameron has always been many things. She is a mother of two, she's a best-selling author, she's a teacher, and she spends a lot of time in nature, leading canoe trips and mountaineering. The list goes on and on and on. In 2018, her life was turned upside down when a dark spot in her shoulder turned out to be melanoma, and it wouldn't be the last. That changed the way she sees herself and the outdoors, especially at this time of the year. She wrote about all of that in a beautiful piece for Outside Magazine, and Claire Cameron is with me in studio now. Good morning.
Good morning, Matt.
In this piece, you say that moving through mountains, over lakes, and across snow is who I am. What does the outdoors mean to you?
It is where I found myself, I'd say, as a teenager. I went on my first canoe trip for 30 days into Superior and the White River, and I just found my sense of self and where I belonged. I met my husband teaching for Outward Bound in Oregon. It's defined all my personal relationships and my relationship to the world, really.
I want to come back to that. In the introduction, I mentioned the diagnosis of melanoma. What happened with that diagnosis?
So it was in 2018, I just turned and I had what was just a normal small freckle on my shoulder. And it all of a sudden had turned into this like black dot. I felt like a pirate being served. I knew right away something was wrong. Partly because my dad had died of melanoma.
And so when you went to the doctor, what happened?
So she was concerned and took it off right away. My general GP did, and they tested it, and it was melanoma. And then I had an operation which is called a wide incision, where they take basically a shark bite out to get a margin around the cancer.
What did the doctor tell you about when you came out of that? What would happen with your life in future when it came to how you should think about your life, how you should think about living that life and what you needed to do differently, perhaps?
So I ended up actually having right before that operation, we found 4 instances of melanoma, and I was 45, so it was a lot. The surgeon had a suspicion and did a genetic test, and I have a mutation, which makes me less resistant to the sun than most people. So his advice was the ideal amount of UV exposure for me is none, which you can't live that way. And he acknowledged that, but he said you have to try and aim in that direction.
The ideal amount of UV exposure is none.
None. You need vitamin D from the sun in order to live, and vitamin D is important in cancer prevention. So I'm kind of in a loop there, an impossible loop.
As you mentioned, your father died of melanoma. How old were you then?
I was 11 years old, grade 5.
Grade 5. You wrote about this again in this piece. When you're that young, I mean, it's impossible to process at any age, but it really, really threw you for a loop, right?
Yes. And being in the outdoors is really how I sort of went numb after my father died. Being so young, I think that was my coping mechanism. And it was really through the outdoors that I came alive again. I started to feel maybe my inclination towards more extreme sports like rock climbing and mountaineering has something to do with that, with waking myself up.
You started to feel.
I started to feel.
What does that mean?
I went very flat for so many years from grief. So being outdoors brings you in the present because you're always assessing risk. You're always weighing your circumstances. You're weighing the people you're with. And you have no choice but to be right there, right then. And
that happened, I mean, you mentioned a canoe trip. That happened on a canoe trip, right?
That happened on a canoe trip first, and then I pursued. I started going west and climbing mountains and rocks and all sorts of things, anything I could.
So when the doctor, in the context of that, when the doctor says that the amount of exposure to UV that would be best for you is nothing, what goes through your mind?
Oh, I thought it was a joke. It sounded like if you could, if the cosmos could conspire against me, that would be the sentence to deliver. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it for quite a long time. I kept thinking I'd wake up and that wouldn't be true. So much of my relationship with my husband and my kids all evolves around the outdoors. So I actually couldn't imagine what my life would be.
How did you tell your husband? I mean, again, you met in the outdoors. In the piece, he talks about he's from California.
He had the funniest reaction. It was like a few months later, and he just turned to me and he said, "But I'm from California," as if there was someone we could bargain with, or his disbelief was also, it was hard to kick out of that stage.
What did you think that was going to mean for your life? I mean, when somebody says that to you, that could mean that you just stay inside. You could think, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to get outside?
I have a friend who was like, "Oh, I'm so jealous because then I wouldn't have to go on those stupid family hikes, I always have to go on." But for me, it was the opposite. It was like I actually couldn't, especially as I get older, that's what I imagine myself doing. So I had to confront how to live with this limitation. And that's really been the project of the last few years, of how to make the best of it.
Well, and part of that comes, we've talked about canoe trips. Part of that comes on another canoe trip that you took.
Yes. So my husband, I couldn't quite let it go. So about a year after my diagnosis and my operation, I was much stronger. And so we went to Algonquin Park, which is a place I love, and just tried a canoe trip. And we were paddling out onto Opiongo Lake, which is a huge lake. It was October. I went in a time when I knew it was low UV, but still the water reflects, the canoe was reflecting. And my husband turned to me and he said he could see the sun dappling on the bottom of my chin. It's just not a great choice. And he just said, I don't think we should be here.
So even something like that would matter. You've taken all the steps that you think would be appropriate.
Yeah, I had sunscreen on. It's just a matter of choices. So when we went, we were on that canoe trip, and he's actually, because he's from California, he was looking at the map of Algonquin Park. And he was asking me about these other strange lines. And I was like, oh, yeah, I don't know. I've spent so much time in the park, I didn't know what they were. Turns out they're hiking trails. I was so set on trying to get back to what I was. I couldn't see, that's what I thought recovery was, what I used to be. I didn't realize that there were other ways forward. So it was on that trip when we decided to start hiking in Algonquin Park, which is just a much better choice, not being on the reflective surface, being able to get in under the canopy, not hike during the midday. There's a lot more control over the UV. So it really opened the possibilities. Before
he saw those lines on the map, did you think, what did you think? When you go on this trip and he says this, I can see the sun reflecting off your chin. What did you think?
I was so set on getting back to what I was. I'd never had a major operation or recovered, and I didn't understand what it was to live with limitations. So I had an able-bodied mind that was so certain that recovery meant I would be what I was. So that was the trip when I managed to let that go. And I said, I'm something new. I've changed shape.
He said to you, what if this isn't our last canoe trip, but the first day we start backcountry hiking?
That's when you know you've married the right man.
It's a really beautiful thing.
It is, yeah. Yeah, because he's very willing to go on this journey. He's a big surfer, too, so he's been looking at all the surf breaks in Northern Ireland.
Where there might not be a lot of sun.
Exactly. It's like where vampires go to surf. It's perfect.
So what do you do now when you're given this directive from the doctor and you understand that you are outdoors, that you can't separate the two?
Yeah.
Aside from the hiking, how are you getting that thing that you're looking for? What do you do to get that?
So once I accepted these new constraints, if you put constraints on something, I do this in my writing all the time. If you make decisions that you're working within a certain boundary, you can actually get very creative in that boundary. So this winter, for example, I was up, it was a full moon, and I looked out the window. We were up near Collingwood, and I saw the moonlight reflecting on the sun. And because it was winter, there was no leaves on the trees, and there was these beautiful stripes along the snow. And I thought, this is the perfect time to go cross-country skiing. And I don't think under any other circumstances you could have pried me out of my pajamas to get in my ski gear and go. I had the most spectacular ski because the snow caught the moonlight. It was sparkling, glittering. It looked like there was diamonds all over the ground. And I went on a old snowmobile trail and just had the most beautiful time, an experience I never would have had otherwise.
You run at dusk as well?
I run at dusk. Yeah, I was just joking the other day that my bedtime and run time are starting to merge. But I try and run an hour and a half before the sun goes down. And I do that all year round, so I'm sort of like a sundial.
How do you explain to people why you do the things that you do?
This has been a bit of a journey because it was awkward at first. And I have quite a rare condition. I don't think there's that, although I'm not sure how many people have been tested for mutations as well. But I don't meet anyone else with my condition. I was out to lunch with a friend, and it was just after the pandemic and things. So we were dining outside. And she asked the host if we could sit in the shade, and we had to move the table. And he sort of was treating her like she was a bit fussy and that sort of thing. And she turned to him and she said, "My friend has a disability." And, it was said out of love, and she was frustrated. She's my fiercely loyal friend. And it just was hearing her say it that I thought, oh, that's right. Actually, I have limitations. So sometimes I say that, if I'm going to speak somewhere, I was doing an event in Banff and I needed to make sure I was indoors. So I just said, I have a disability. I can't be in the sun. And it was just so clean. It meant she didn't have to understand my rare condition. I didn't have to go into a cancer story. And so I'm just clear about it.
Have your kids been tested for this mutation?
No. So they're both making that choice individually, but they have a 50% chance.
Why did you write this piece now? I mean, it's a beautiful piece, but it comes at an interesting time. We just come through a long weekend in many parts of the country. It's kind of the unofficial start to summer. A lot of people are going to be spending a lot of time outdoors. Why did you write it now?
Partly because of that. It's what I call my vampire season. It's, the season where it gets harder for me to exist. I've also been on a longer project of thinking through how to live with cancer. And, I get screened all the time. And since that first instance of cancer, I've had 6 different instances, one in my eye. So I sort of live with what feels a bit like a ticking bomb. So I've been writing a book that's coming out in January about that longer, of like how to cope with fear.
In the face of that, you could imagine some people would say, the ticking bomb is one thing, but also that you have had things taken away from you. Mm-hmm. But at the end of this piece that you wrote for Outside, you said, "I've never been so alive." Mm-hmm. What did you mean by that?
I think part of this idea that the outdoors wakes me up, that, being close to a ledge or dangling off a cliff has been the thing that brings sensation. And, there's nothing like being on a precipice to make you see clearly and make you understand the people you're with and who you trust and that sort of thing. And so that used to only be in the outdoors. Now that's come into my everyday life. And I try and confront that with like a sense of excitement and adventure as much as I can.
But you also haven't lost that thing that you love. You're still outdoors. You're still doing the things that you want to do.
Yeah, sometimes at midnight, yes.
As a vampire.
As a vampire.
It's a really beautiful piece, and I look forward to the longer investigation of it in the book. In the meantime, Claire, thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Claire Cameron is a Toronto-based author and outdoor enthusiast. She wrote about all of the things we have been talking about in a piece for Outside Magazine. If you just Google Claire Cameron and Outside Magazine, you'll be able to find that.